Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part 6 of Bond's webinar series on data privacy and cybersecurity for higher education institutions. This webinar series focuses on the intersection of higher education and data privacy and cybersecurity. Today's discussion will focus on cyber insurance. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address those throughout the program. Please remember to fill out the survey following today's presentation. Today, we are pleased to welcome Gabriel Overfield, a member of Bond's Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Practice Group, to this series.
Thank you, Kathy, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. I look forward very much to, in this next hour or so, walking through key considerations regarding cybersecurity and insurance. It's a great opportunity for us to share what we know as a firm and with any luck to educate all of you who have chosen to spend this next hour or so with us. And so I'll be your presenter today. And if Kathy, you could go to the next slide, let me walk through the elements that I'm hopeful we'll be able to cover over the course of this time together. So to begin, we'll be looking at the fundamentals of cyber insurance, and in particular, thinking about why your organization should have that policy set and otherwise maintain it and vigorously continue to improve upon it. It's also important to recognize that there has been significant volatility in that market, some of it very much driven by the pandemic and by other contributory factors that I'll address later this afternoon. It's also useful for us to talk about the current state of cyber insurance, where we are, more or less at this moment, and what we prognosticate, as it were, for the future in this space. And there are also, of course, key considerations that we want to make sure that we're covering today for institutions of higher ed with regard to purchasing and renewing policies. So those are some of the mechanics and otherwise the material that I'm expecting to walk through with all of you. As Kathy said during the opening, please note that you have the option to enter questions through the Q&A tool available to you. Over the course of the webinar, I'll do my best to address those. It may be that most of those are ones that I will attend to toward the concluding moments of this webinar, but we will do our best, though, to be responsive along the way. Next slide, please. And so let me just remind all of you, as Kathy mentioned, that this is the 6th in the series that we have held for IHEs with connection to cybersecurity and data privacy. And so, of course, this is a series that any of you can access online. If you look at the snapshot of the Bond webpage, you'll see where that all is available. Certainly, you can follow up whether directly with me or our marketing team if you cannot find those materials, and if you wish to find any of this as you later review and wish to reference it. So next slide, please, Kathy. So let me just tell you a little bit about who I am as your presenter today, because certainly when in your shoes, I'm interested in knowing the guidance and perspective that I'm receiving. And so with that in mind, let me tell you a little bit about what brings me to this program. So I joined Bond following stints as a trade association senior executive with the Greater New York Hospital Association family. I was also with New York City's government. I'm speaking with you, by the way, from New York City today, Midtown Manhattan, where it's beautiful outside and spring is here. I was a member of the mayor's administration, Michael Bloomberg specifically, both as an agency chief of staff and as well in the mayor's office itself. And before that, I spent time as an advocate in a national not-for-profit doing legislative and regulatory work. And that is all germane to some of the more specific background that brings me to this presentation. Among things that I did within the Greater New York family was both organizing and implementing a wide-ranging emergency preparedness curriculum for those whom we represented, including ultimately putting forth a citywide tabletop exercise that was focused on cybersecurity, which required and thankfully was benefited by the involvement of a variety of federal and state stakeholders, whether the Federal Department of Homeland Security, CISA, as well as New York State analogs. So I have some applied experience, as it were, in the space that I bring to this conversation. I'm also a member of the 405D working group, which may not be entirely familiar to those of you who come to this conversation as members of institutions of higher education, but it's a federal working group that looks at the intersection of healthcare and cybersecurity readiness. And it's a place where I volunteer time and also from which there's a wide array of resources, some of which I'll bring to your attention today. And in my practice, I work very closely with the IHE group, as well as Kathy noted, I'm a member of the cybersecurity and data privacy group. My focus is in healthcare by and large, and that is the entry point by which I contemplate these matters, and I look forward to providing guidance as we progress today. And finally, for those of you who tune in on Tuesday afternoons to Bond's weekly webinar, I am the co-host of that every other week, and perhaps I've met some of you there too. Next slide, please. You'll notice that today we are not with Gail Norris, who is a senior counsel in our firm and who was intending to co-present with me. Unfortunately, Gail is a bit under the weather, but is very much here and literally tuned in with us, as well a very important contributor to all that I am presenting today on our team's behalf. And if you have questions and follow-up, I want to ensure that you know Gail is very much ready to answer them on behalf of our practice more broadly, of course, as am I. We also benefited, Gail and I, that is, as we develop this materials from working with Sam Brewster, an associate with the firm. And much of the information that you see presented here comes from research that Sam provided. Next slide, please. So let's get to it. So the stakes around cybersecurity and in particular, the reason why we're here to talk about insurance is patent to most of you if you've made the choice to tune in, but let's talk about in detail some of the environmental elements that really are circulating and otherwise that are critical for us to contemplate as sort of the foundation for what it is we're going to talk about today. We know that the potential risk for institutions of higher ed is increasing, as is the liability exposure. We also know that cyber insurance is one of the most accepted business practices for risk mitigation. And in that context, the policies hold more value than ever they have. It's also a time where the cyber insurance industry is maturing, changing, shifting rather rapidly. And as a consequence, there is a wide array of availability of products, at least in terms of form and construction. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. As all of you know, as representatives of institutions of higher education, none of you is the same, and nor is it the case that with policies, you'll see that kind of uniformity. So we're going to get into some of those particulars today as well. And the goal of today is to, as it were, keep up with the changes. Next slide, please. So what are some of the things that with insurance policies, institutions like yours might be wishing to protect against? Let's just talk through some of them. You, as a group, rely heavily on technology to operate. And with that comes exposure. Whether you're doing it at one campus or many, as is the case, the decentralization is a reality for numerous institutions of higher education. Yes, there may be some centralization around certain core concepts, operations, et cetera, but to the degree there are numerous campuses, numerous sites, numerous professionals, that decentralization is a point of exposure. You also, as a group, manage and otherwise are responsible for large volumes of personal data. Just think, for example, what's collected during the financial aid process. That in and of itself is a, as it were, treasure trove for those who are wishing to do ill with those data. And these are some of the reasons why cyber insurance is so critical. Let's move then to another area, which is where government fits in. At state and federal levels, we know that there's a growing abundance of privacy regulations. We'll get to some of those more discreetly later in the presentation. We also know that many of your counterparts from a contractual basis are expecting that you will have this insurance. And so it's going to be very important for you to make sure that when you come prepared to negotiate, you have these policies in place. Your boards may require them as well. Ratings agencies may look for these policies as a means of ultimately proceeding with the bond rating processes, critical for institutional financing. And then you also have to think about what your third-party exposure is. You, as institutions, of course, have branches in many different places, and with that, vendors on whom you rely. And these policies are there to protect you not only against your own missteps, as it were, but it's also there to look at that broader network, that broader environment in which you operate. Next slide, please. Thank you, Kathy. So the national environment I alluded to just a moment ago, but let me drill down on two examples that I think are going to be worthwhile just to illustrate the point. So in the Massachusetts state legislature here in the Northeast, there is a piece of legislation that, if approved, would require any state agency that's procuring technology goods or services to give preference to vendors that carry cyber insurance. That's a big deal. And we don't know whether it's necessarily a canary in a coal mine, as it were, or otherwise a signal of what's ahead. But this kind of legislative activity is far from atypical around the country. And let's turn to an S&P report for a bit of contrast and further context. So back in September 22, S&P noted that of the colleges whose debt they evaluated, about 450 of them have cyber insurance policies with average coverage amounts, of just under $8 million. And we can assume that those that don't have that kind of coverage are public institutions or otherwise situated where they might be able to rely on things like sovereign immunity doctrine or state defenses. But that number, 447 across the country, is obviously quite significant. And so there is this increasing volume of institutions with these policies. Again, another reason why we're here to talk about them. Next slide, please. So let's go through some of the basics of what a cyber insurance policy might cover. And as I said, there is not one type, there is not one singular best practice. You really have to, as an institution, evaluate what your intrinsic and unique needs are. But some of the ways that cyber insurance might be protective include looking at network security and failures thereof. Also, of course, it can be very expensive to pay for the legal costs that might attend to any kind of issue around cybersecurity. One can think of, again, the value of those data, the need to otherwise, work with counsel in order to manage various privacy concerns that might require interface with regulators, as alluded to earlier. So these kinds of interactions are absolutely the ones that may be planned for in a policy. Ransomware is something that all of you are, of course, familiar with. It is no longer the stuff of imagination. Literally, cities have been shut down as a result of ransomware attacks, as have institutions of higher education, quite unfortunately. And so having a plan for payment is very much a part of what it is to be ready and prepared. And many of these policies have terms and conditions that attend to that. Data restoration is another piece. To the extent you have essentially architecture that needs to be restored, there is a cost to that too. There may also be technical elements to it that go beyond what you as an institution can manage in-house. So the policy, in some instances, has terms and conditions that are attendant to those dynamics, and if important to your institution, worth thinking about. Similarly, forensic work is something to recognize may well be important. If there is a cyber attack, let's say hypothetically, and unfortunately one can assume there will be of one form or another among someone here listening or otherwise, it's important to have the tools to really get to the root of it, to understand why it happened, how it happened. And that's where forensics come in. And you need to be able to essentially plan for the costs of those, as well as for the execution of forensic expert technical advice. And so that's just another piece to pay heed to. And then there are all of those privacy concerns that I touched on a moment ago. Remember, that example I shared about the information collected for the purposes of financial aid, that is certainly something that has a monetary value attached to it. Business interruption I've alluded to as well, errors and omissions, where things could have been avoided but weren't. That's part of what these policies also may be structured to attend to. These policies are, again, though, changing, branching, shifting. And so there's a lot here to consider. Social engineering, interestingly, is part of what we're now seeing covered for, I should say. Social engineering, for those of you uninitiated, is essentially the work of those who skillfully seek to manipulate individuals to gain their trust and then otherwise to gain access to systems. These are sometimes very much, as it were, nefarious actors whose very efforts are the reasons why data are compromised or otherwise breaches take place. And so there are policies that contemplate those kinds of scenarios and have language in place to protect against them. Brand reputation is another big part of this, as well as media liability. Not every policy covers these things squarely, but just be aware that's on the table. And it's important just to think about the way cyber insurance policies interact with other existing policies. Many traditional liability insurance policies now have exclusions for cyber-related risk. This is something that has very much developed in the last few years. And think about D&O insurance, for instance. You'll have very express loss, or rather carve-outs, for loss of PII. And if in a cyber policy you don't have that matching coverage built back in, you've got a problem. These are the kinds of things that we see, unfortunately, in terms of what comes to our practice. And so we mention it now as the kind of sets of issues, as it were, that you should be guarding against and otherwise finding solutions for. Also adding to the challenges and why cyber insurance policies are important, we have federal actors, including the FTC, focusing on CISOs and CIOs for their alleged omissions, errors, those kinds of elements that I alluded to higher up. So it's not just that things are costly, it's that, again, there is this overlay of regulatory structure that you all need to worry about. Next slide, please, Kathy. So cyber insurance underwriting, is just another part of what we want to draw your attention to here. So it's a critical piece of how your policies are ultimately effectuated. And the real the real centerpiece of it, as it were, is the application. The application is something that has changed, matured itself, otherwise that has become a tremendously central part of what it is to procure coverage. And ultimately, the application becomes incorporated as part of the terms of coverage. And false statements are very dangerous in that context. They have the power to void coverage. And so it's important for those of you who may be in position both to oversee the completion of these applications or otherwise to check for their veracity and otherwise the representations they're in, to make sure that everything checks out, as it were, because again, these are essentially the underpinning by which a provider will be willing to grant insurance. And it has been the reason why some have found their way out of it, as it were. There's a case just recently, Travelers Insurance versus International Control Services, which got coverage because in the end, the alleged misrepresentations around what ICS was and was not doing in terms of protecting data and operations resulted in a settlement where ICS essentially was no longer insured, and the policy was rescinded. And so that is, a worst case, and the exposure, of course, for the institution was profound. But you have to also know that these applications are not necessarily written for you. So think, for instance, about knowing again that many of you as institutions operate with multiple campuses and multiple sub-ecosystems, as it were. You have multi-factor authentication as just one tool to keep things safe. Do you have MFA everywhere? You may or you may not. Can you answer in a checkbox kind of way that you do? Probably not. So these are the kinds of things that you would need to be looking at, carefully focusing on and thinking about in your negotiations. So again, just to underscore the point, mind the gaps, as it were, and just note that not every policy is the same. You need to pay attention to exclusions. You need to pay attention to various limitations, deductibles, carve-outs, things that get in the way of giving you the kind of robust policy that you're hopeful for when you engage with a provider. So let's go to the next slide, please, Kathy. And let me talk a little bit now about what we saw during 21 and 22. This is a time, of course, when we were enduring what was, with any luck, a once-in-a-lifetime disruption through the pandemic. Today, of course, May 11th is notable because the public health emergency is winding down. So we're at a moment of inflection, as it were. But as we look back in time in terms of how we got here, there was a perfect storm of market disruption where we saw an increase in frequency of cyber attacks. We saw greater losses for each of those cyber attacks. We also saw many individuals migrating to work from home in a somewhat spontaneous fashion, given the profound nature of disruption that we saw due to the pandemic. We also saw that insurers were having trouble keeping up. Loss coverage ratios and issues there were a major problem. And we saw capacity in the market decreasing just at the time when the demand, the need for protection was all the more patent than it ever had been. Reinsurers were also absorbing the ramifications, as it were, of that highly volatile marketplace. And then you combine that with these privacy regulations I mentioned a moment ago. And what we saw, and otherwise, what we will comment on as I continue, is just a market that looked nothing like the period preceding the pandemic. It was one where the changes were so profound and so fast that I'm confident each of you experienced that profound difference in visceral ways. So let's go to the next slide, please. So let's talk about the context, why that market became so otherwise unsteady. During 2022 alone, according to Sophos, there was a 41% increase in ransomware attacks. The average cost of these attacks in 22 in the higher ed space was about $1.5 million. Phishing attacks, which I'm confident all of you have experienced, unfortunately, one way or the other, in the higher ed space increased by 48% in just the first half of 2022 when compared with the totality of 2021. And then the average cost for a data breach in the US, according to IBM, pushed up toward $10 million. And it's not quite a rule of thumb, but it's something to think about. And it makes sense that the longer it took for the discovery of a breach, following when the breach actually transpired, the more likely the recovery costs were going to be bigger and otherwise more significant. Put another way, the longer someone was snooping around and otherwise taking advantage of an exposure, the more likely the pain and financial consequence the institution would suffer. So the size of the cyber insurance market at the same time rose 61% between 20 and 21 in terms of the overall amount of business flowing through to $6.5 billion. And at the same time, premiums rose by 74%. That's, of course, a huge, huge difference. And so now we look at cybersecurity budgets across the country as a relative component of IT budgets, and it's about 10 to 14%. That is no small amount. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned a moment ago, some of the focal reasons why we saw the market change and change so quickly include that move to working remotely. We are not done with that by any stretch. We know that there are differing approaches that institutions of higher education are taking to the continuation of online work, to hybrid work, to what it is to conduct e-learning. All of that is very much a national work in progress, as it were. But this also has effects on the insurance market and its stability. It's not enough that VPN technology improved tremendously and found its way out into the world, including among your institutions. Insurers are still a bit skittish, as it were, as a general characterization of the market. With all of that, all of those touch points, as it were, to the various institutions that are harder to control because they are literally remote and otherwise potentially increasing of the liability to insure against. So one of the ways that insurers are focusing on that is in those applications and otherwise through negotiations, looking for greater upfront assurances about the quality and seriousness by which networks are secured. So I just note that as one important environmental factor here. Next slide, please. So as a result of the cyber insurance crisis, if we can call it that, I'll just reiterate that premium increases really rose and rose quickly. Coverage limits decreased, which is, of course, not what anyone is looking for. But the reality, as these insurers had large and unsustainable, in some instances, payouts to manage. And then again, and this is essentially the same point, insurers are focused on capping and otherwise controlling the costs of what they underwrite. And so this has effects on the market. So too do emerging technologies and the changing by the minute type of dynamic that we see vis-a-vis technology, whether it's cryptocurrency, the Internet of Things, cloud technology, and misconfigurations that lead to exposure. These are the kinds of things that insurers are very much attuned to and reluctant to insure for unless they are comfortable with the kinds of protections that clients can demonstrate. So that ties into that increased budget that you saw, that upward push of 10 to 14%. And there is also, again, just to reiterate, that exposure that you're seeing increasingly, if you're not careful, about calibrating between what a cyber insurance policy covers and what more standard policy coverage would otherwise protect for, such as D&O. Next slide, please. Thank you, Kathy. So I mentioned that part of my work is working within the healthcare environment, and so I come across news, and I thought this was totally germane to the presentation here, so I'm sharing it with you. There was a study within JAMA that was just published earlier this week, and I know that none of you per se comes to this first and foremost as a hospital or health system, although I know that some of you may operate academic medical institutions, for instance. And so in JAMA, there was this observation that was borne out through study that a cyber attack on a hospital not only has effects on the hospital itself that is effectively locked up and shut down, but it has effects on the community. Notably, the study's authors suggest that targeted hospital cyber attacks may be associated with disruptions of non-targeted hospitals within a community and should be considered a regional disaster. That's pretty profound stuff. And so I mention that just because the stakes for cybersecurity and the overall environment around its import has dramatically elevated in just a few years. And we are seeing it as, core to what it is to have communities that are operating stably. Next slide, please. And let's turn back to institutions of higher education, particularly in New York, where I'm speaking with you from, as an exemplar, though, of what we see nationally. I know that many of you tuning in are not seated here in New York, but just please look at these data as a means of exemplifying the point. In 2021, New York had the highest number of ransomware attacks on schools and colleges, with 7 that were tracked, accounting for 10% of those recorded nationally. That's just here in New York. And then from January of 18 until May of 22, there were 21 publicly disclosed attacks overall, affecting 153 schools or colleges and tallying to 1.37 billion in costs associated with downtime alone. So again, the stakes are very high. Next slide, please. So I'm sure that all of this is of general posture anyway, not news to those tuning in. You've chosen to be part of this webinar because you recognize just how important it is to be focused on cyber insurance. But let's talk about where we see it all going. And so again, there's been a profound amount of change in the last 24 months. There are new carriers entering the market, which is increasing competition. And that in and of itself is starting to put some downward pressure on premium increases. But as I alluded to earlier, it is not the case that policies are being handed out, as it might have been functionally the case in the early going of when this industry was getting its bearings. It is, again, a very different kind of environment in terms of how one secures insurance. You have to, as it were, prove it as an organization that you are worthy of it in the eyes of the insurer. So just keep that in mind, because even though we are seeing, again, that downward pressure with more providers in the marketplace, it is still comparatively more challenging administratively and otherwise to procure these policies and maintain them than it might have been even just a few years ago. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the key security protections that are inherent in policies and worth your consideration. So you're going to want to make sure that a policy encompasses language around incident response, not only what your obligations are, but all the more what your insurer's obligations are to you if there are issues where you need help, you need skills, you need hands-on support. I mentioned as well, you need to really understand that remote access policy because that is a key point of friction, if not vulnerability, where insurers are very cautious as a field around that dynamic. And then you also need to look very carefully at vendor management. As I alluded to earlier, institutions of higher education have branches that invariably involve vendors, and invariably the ways in which those vendors are managed in terms of their cyber hygiene is quite critical for the policy and understanding essentially what the expectations are of the insurer versus what yours are and what you think you may be able to rely on if ever you need to enact the policy's protections. You need to really understand that, get your arms around it, and make sure that there is no daylight as between the two parties, as it were. And so just another thing to think about in terms of the overall amount that you protect for monetarily, as one way to measure it, know that the market in cybercrime, as it were, is increasingly sophisticated. And one of the dynamics that has been reported and otherwise observed is that there are instances where cyber criminals are savvy enough to access the terms of one's policy, of a provider's policy. That can happen through, utilizing whatever access they might have found in order to review information within a network, within an institution. They get their hands on the policy one way or the other, as it were, and they recognize what the insured amounts are. And then they issue demands that are pegged to that insured amount. It doesn't happen in every case, but it has happened in some cases. And so just know that you need to think about the practical reality that you may be held for ransom and that you may need to produce funds and produce them quickly. There are overlays, of course, with federal and state regulatory bodies around how one is to respond to ransomware attacks. That's not the subject of today's dialogue, I note, but it is certainly a major dynamic, and lots of policies are structured to provide provisions around that reality. Next slide, please. So let's just think about some other key attributes for your policy. And so some of them would be to make sure you're looking closely at what happens if there's a data breach. We talked earlier about the financial aid type information. That's only one version of the data that might get out there, as it were, if there were a breach. You also want to, again, think about the interrelatedness with your vendors. And what happens if data that are yours are mismanaged by vendors, and how is that mitigated for or otherwise contemplated within your policy? Think about, again, your network and what you can control and how breaches of your network are protected and otherwise insured for. Recognize that cyber attacks are truly global. And if you have branches of your operations around the world, the proverbial weakest link of yours is the one that may be exploited. And so know that is very real, and you need to be thinking about your operations around your insurance policies and otherwise their robustness, in some instances, a multinational fashion. Another aspect to think about here, cyber attacks are not undertaken exclusively by individuals or small informal teams. Nations and nation states are involved these days, and the stakes are rather significant. And so having upfront protections to avoid them or otherwise mitigate as best possible is important. And there are policy terms that attend to those realities depending on what one negotiates. You also need to make sure that your policies are structured in such a way that there is allowance for and otherwise appreciation for that. There may be intentional acts, there may be omissions, there may be accidents, as it were, the truly unintentional. All of that needs to be covered in order for you to be best protected. And you just need to make sure that, again, you're paying close attention to the carve-outs. You also want to recognize, again, that there are these other dynamics that are part of what as a world we are essentially living with right now, and how it affects the policy that you might choose to procure. There are these extortionary actors through the ransomware attacks that I've mentioned before. There are active acts of terrorism that happen, unfortunately, through cyber warfare. And these are the kinds of dynamics that are written for in terms of policy terms and conditions, and you need to pay close heed to whether what you're seeking to sign up for has those kinds of protections as it relates to essentially things that may be out of your control. Just to be more concrete about it, if there are acts of war that are cyber driven, are you protected? Or has your insurer written in language that, unless you're paying attention, you might miss, that suggests, for acts that are nation state in their orientation, the coverage is no longer viable. Just think about those kinds of elements because they're very critical to the kind of strength and four-corner protection that you would wish to have. Next slide, please. So let me just list out a few other attributes of policies that you may want to make sure that you have in place, and that you should note further, no one way is the right way here, but these are just some of the attributes. And both on the last slide and this, these information elements are attributable to the 405D group I mentioned at the top, that I'm a member of the group, and there are a number of publications that this group has put forth that I'll mention in just a moment. But some of the elements that the 405D group recommends as critical here, as you contemplate, again, the shape of your policy, will you have funds to defend yourself in a lawsuit or a regulatory investigation? Often this is described as the duty to defend. We've also talked about how your coverages meet up and otherwise overlay. You just need to make sure you have enough money where you expect to have it. You also want to make sure that if there is some sort of breach, some sort of concern that you hold, that your insurer is going to be available when you need that insurer. You want to be able to call that insurer and reach out 24/7, because of course the world operates on a 24/7 basis, and you never know exactly when an attack may take place, and you need to just be prepared. Also make sure that as far as negotiating your terms, that you both have access to professionals, and who are professionals that are working not on the insurer's behalf, but on your behalf, which is, to put it another way, of course, the dynamics in procuring a policy are such that the insurance company is, as a general matter, looking to limit its liability wherever it can. That is how the business model is successful, grossly stated. And so you just want to make sure that the third-party representatives are neutrals or otherwise do not have a vested financial interest in any which way they might approach mitigating or resolving issues around a cyber breach. So just keep that in mind. And so also keep that in mind for various forms of incident response that go beyond those third-party specialists. You also want to think about whether your policy provides coverage for you if you need to go forward and make third-party notifications. Think about whom you might need to share information with that there has been a breach. That varies, of course, depending on the regulatory structure under which you're operating. An attorney here at Bond certainly can help you figure that piece out if ever that were to be an issue you were navigating. Let's hope not. But you need to know, do you have the funds otherwise protected and written into the policy such that if you need to undertake that active notification posture, do you have a means of doing it? You also want to look at loss of business coverage or loss of revenue. I alluded earlier to the fact that entire cities have been locked up by ransomware. And you can imagine a situation where a campus, and unfortunately it has happened, has endured the same. And when that transpires, there are business costs that can be profound and profoundly escalate. And those are costs that, in policies that are carefully constructed and that work for you, are both present and otherwise accounted for. So let's go to the next slide, please, Kathy. So how can you stay on top of all of this? Because I don't want to present this as an entirely doom and gloom type of environment, but the reality is that it's fast moving. The tide is changing, and you need to just stay current. So there are lots of industry tools that one can sign up for. Here at Bond, of course, we make information regularly available through our information memoranda and otherwise through presentations like this. So we encourage you just to stay on top of what's new. Regularly assess what you're prioritizing in terms of your vulnerability, because that can change in a minute. We all saw that with the pandemic, where all of a sudden workforces went fully remote or something close to that. And that type of shifting has profound effects on really where your risk is. And then also, you want to look, again, just harkening back to the last slide, carefully at the services insurers offer in connection with their policies. It is not enough to know that you have funds there if you need them, and knock on wood, that would be the case if ever you needed them in a policy that's well structured. But you want to make sure that the operational resources are also available to you, again, to underscore a point of a moment ago. Next slide, please. So just a couple of closing points that I want to make. So just knowing that doing nothing is not an option. All of you, I'm sure, appreciate that, but we want to just remind you why you really need to be active in this space. One reason is there is C-suite liability that is very real for cyber incidents, that is increasing in its sophistication and as far as in its reach to the Federal Department of Justice and other similar enforcement bodies are getting into this space. There's an increasing array of enforcement actions that we're mindful about. We also talked about how the way in which D&O policies are changing creates a opening, a vulnerability that you really need to actively manage for here. And again, another key place where you can't be active enough is thinking about your relationship vis-a-vis your vendors and how your insurance policy attaches protections vis-a-vis those vendors. Next slide, please, Kathy. So again, just a few points as we near the end of our time. Across the country, we're seeing a wide array of states that are moving in the direction of privacy protections. They're listed all out here on the slide. I won't belabor them, but just know that across the country, if data are released or otherwise they are not protected to the fullest degree that they could have been relative to the eyes of regulators, there is significant liability here. Cyber insurance policies do not per se cover all of that directly, as I mentioned before, but you need to think about, the points of demarcation or the points of distinction as between the policies you have and these data liability responsibilities. And so cyber insurance is part of that puzzle. Next slide, please. And so just to underscore, there are no specific standards yet in the country requiring that someone or an entity carries cyber insurance or data breach insurance. That noted, you have these emerging privacy requirements across the country. I mentioned earlier in the presentation the expectations that your contracting counterparts have. Even though there is no mandate that we're seeing as a theme across the country to have these policies, the market is dictating a necessity for them. And then there also is a bit of emerging legislative activity, which is something we'll be tracking for you. Some states are offering even tax incentives to invest in policies. If you look at Maryland, there's New York state legislation that, if it were to advance, would potentially provide the same. And the application, though, to institutions of higher ed is not necessarily uniform here. So again, these are just examples, but we want you to be aware of them. And if they're applicable, we're more than happy to dig in more deeply with you to discuss them. Next slide, please. So let's just go through a few tips to really underscore what we're hoping you'll take away from this presentation. Make sure you partner with a broker that you respect and otherwise that you work with to understand the available coverages, to essentially create a marketplace of competition for them, and to secure a policy uniquely tailored for your needs. You can go at it alone. We're not, suggesting that getting a broker is the only way, nor are we, to be clear advising any specific broker. Those are your choices. But at the same time, this is a complicated marketplace, and going for connections to individuals that have taken time and effort to understand that marketplace is important. Be aware of terms, especially exclusions. I jokingly note that if you've seen one policy, you've seen one policy. But the point, I hope, is well taken, that ultimately, if you are building yourself a wall of protection through cyber insurance, you need to know that that wall is uniquely tailored to your institution's needs. You need to think about the costs. We've talked about that in a few different ways here. You need to think about the ways your insurance policies build and layer. You also want to make sure that you are doing everything you can to prevent an incident or otherwise an instance where you need to turn to that policy by working upstream, by training, by doing the kinds of drills and exercise that I mentioned, that I've been involved in, for instance. You can make your organization, more hardened against cybersecurity threats. And then, knock on wood, you don't need to call on that policy very often, if at all. And then you also can do work to build your technical sophistication. I've mentioned MFA more than once. That's just one example. Next slide, please. So let me leave you with a few resources. Again, these are not specifically focused for institutions of higher education, but I encourage all of you to look at them because I think they're quite worthwhile. The 405D group, again, of which I'm a member, has put together essentially tools that provide some of the basics on how you would handle a number of different types of cyber scenarios, including insurance. The tools are very much, in my view, generalizable. So what you see in them is certainly adaptable to the needs and otherwise the considerations of institutions of higher education. And all the more importantly, if you have specific legal concerns, please come to the bond attorney whom you trust and otherwise with whom you wish to dialogue in order to advance whatever questions you may have. And with that, I'm going to turn to the question that I see in the chat from an anonymous attendee, and I'm just going to read it out loud. With the skyrocketing premiums, coverage reductions, and increasingly exacting coverage certifications, I'm aware of a number of IHEs that are considering self-insurance. Any advice on the sort of questions and considerations that should come into play in addressing that question? I won't be able to answer that in full, because we're more or less at time for this presentation, and also because those are the kinds of considerations that are really unique to each institution. But you bring up a very fair point, that the costs are increasing, that they are astronomically, as it were, different than where they had been. But as I noted earlier, we are seeing some downward pressure. We are seeing some leveling in the market. So in short, we encourage you both to understand the market as it is changing as we move into a knock on wood post-pandemic environment, and also to feel free to consult with any of the attorneys here and otherwise with others with experience to contemplate whether a self-insured approach versus a approach in the marketplace is the right one for you. And I encourage all of you, if you have questions, to reach out either to me or to Gail or to any of the attorneys with whom you have a working relationship. Kathy, if you'd advance to the next slide, please. I just want to make sure that all of you know the floor is open for questions, and I don't see any others beyond the one I just addressed, but I do encourage all of you to reach out to me at the contact information available there. And if not me, again, by way of the bond website, you can find the comparable contact information for any attorney that you have a working relationship with. We're hopeful that this has been an instructive component of our 6-part series. We look forward not only to your feedback, but the opportunity to work with you and to continue earning your trust. So we thank you very much for tuning in today, and we look forward to receiving your questions as you have them. In the meanwhile, have a terrific afternoon.